Thank you, Ishaq, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. As Ishaq said, I work for the International Crisis Group. We are a conflict prevention organization. I feel a little bit out of the water in this company. I'm certainly not an economist. In fact, I'm scared as hell to be in an audience of economists and to talk about things of my expertise. I think I flunked economics in college. I don't remember. I don't remember because I suppressed the memory. But I found the discussions in the plenaries in the last 2 days enormously interesting and very helpful to me. And I'm sure that we can derive some mutual benefit from the interaction that we're having and that I'm about to expose you to. I've been able to determine on the basis of what I've heard what is wrong or missing from your analysis, and at the same time, and more importantly, I discovered what is wrong and what is missing from my own analysis, listening to you. And so it's going to be useful to compare a little bit. And so I will speak about the issue that I was asked to speak about, the conflicts in the region, but I also want to reflect a little bit about what I've heard and link that up to my planned presentation. One of the things that I heard in the last 2 days is that in many ways it's the economy stupid. We have to look at the economic conditions that led or contributed to the Arab awakenings and to the breakdown of the social order in the region. But I would argue that it is not, or it is certainly not only, and it's probably not primarily an economic issue we're facing in the region. I'll give you an example through an anecdote. I was, a few days ago, I was in Iraqi Kurdistan in northern Iraq. And as you know, with the low oil price, a lot of the economies, especially the exporting ones, are in big trouble. But especially ones that are already exposed for other reasons. I mean, the Kurdish economy is clearly a distorted one, a rentier economy, heavily dependent on the public sector through oil revenue. It's a case of state-led corruption that goes to the very top, or starts from the very top. It's a repressive duopoly. It's two-party control, but increasingly becoming a repressive monopoly. And there's of hope and of prospects for the future. And in a particular case, and it's just emblematic, I think, I don't want to say that everybody thinks like the case of my friend, but I have this friend who is a human rights activist, who is in his 40s. He's been around for a long time. I've known him for many years. A very optimistic fellow who was not affected by the latest serious problem in the Iraqi Kurdistan region, which is that public salaries have been cut. Or been seriously delayed, and people are now getting their salaries from November. They just got them last week, but they didn't get the full amount. So they're far behind, plus they lost 3 months in the fall, which are put in reserve somewhere, and they hope to get back at some point. And so people are really smarting under the hardship of not having an income, and the public sector is huge. So many people are dependent on it, and it has led, as a reaction, certainly in the area or in the city where I was most recently, in Sulaymaniyah, to a response from the public sector workers. They went on strike. And so now the health sector, the educational sector are flat. No one is working. So when my friend, who continued to work because he is working for an NGO that gets foreign funding, had a crisis when his 10-year-old son cut himself with a knife, and it was a fairly deep cut that needed antibiotics and stitching and whatnot. He rushed to the emergency room. Not only could he not get help from the doctors who were there, who were refusing to work, but they laughed at him. And this hurt, because these were people who themselves were victims of the economic crisis, but they laughed at anybody who would come in and ask even for medical help. And he says, at that moment, I decided to leave. That was it. And so now he's planned to leave, and he's going. And that is emblematic because many people I talk to are ready to leave if they can. In his case, he can. In other cases, it's more difficult now that Turkey requires a visa. But this is very important because there was something that there was a tipping point. And it shows, and I think it's similar to the case of the Tunisian street vendor who immolated himself. In the end, it was not the economic situation per se that affected that individual, but it was the treatment they received. And so it's a psychological factor, and it goes into the human rights situation as well. But individual cases don't make a mass uprising, and we have to ask, how did the uprisings take off in the Arab world? And even in the Kurdish situation, by the way, because there was a Kurdish spring as well in Sulaymaniyah for several months back in 2011. And so we need to look at, for sure, at economic conditions. We cannot ignore them. But we have to look at it in combination with repression that took place and what I call conspicuous corruption, not just any corruption, but also the social media element, which provides both a check on or a competition with authority, but also a way of networking and a sense of community against that authority. And very importantly, a tone-deaf response from the state. And so when I heard yesterday, of course there was an emphasis on economic factors, but I think there was a conclusion that social injustice was one of the key drivers, and that in fact there was a breakdown of the social contract. And in fact, Ambassador Fahmy reiterated that point, that this is a key factor. And I think where we come together as economists and non-economists is the question of the social contract and what was referred to yesterday as the need for a new social contract. Now, I agree with this globally, but I have some caveats. First of all, I discovered in the discussion that transpired that I want to start with to say that a social contract assumes, first of all, a degree of mutual consent. But what has been the case with the social contracts in the Arab world is that it seems to be mostly non-negotiated and imposed from above. People have bought into it, in a sense. But it was not a free negotiation between a population that participated politically, but an arrangement that was comfortable in some ways and tolerated, and that worked until it didn't. Secondly, the social contract is not just economic, but listening yesterday I heard the composition of the social contract is public sector jobs, free health and education, subsidies on basic goods. That's all well and fine, but of course there is another critical component to the social contract, which is protection, or stability, or security, whatever you want to call it. And people have been willing for a long time to trade in some of their freedom and some of their rights in order to get both the political and security and economic benefits. And that has been the de facto social contract. And thirdly, the social contract has been coming apart over time via deregulation and privatization, via the conspicuous corruption that I mentioned, via the state repression. And so it was de facto being renegotiated, but again without political participation. And this has caused a lot of dislocation, economic dislocation, but also disorientation. And you add that to an emerging youth bulge which lacks opportunities, and you see the problem. And finally, I would say that we have seen not only a breakdown of the social contract, but also of the social fabric of society. And this has serious implications for rebuilding. So now I go back to my original presentation and the issue of conflict. I think the main reasons, factors that informed the breakdown of the Arab awakenings and the intended move towards a new order into civil conflict, one of the main factors was regime manipulation of the fault lines in society. In many cases, these were ethnic or sectarian fault lines, but not always. And regimes managed to instill a fear of the alternative. They said, in the end, we provide stability. Yes, there was an uprising, but we can accommodate you. But guess what? Who is wanting to come in? Some radical actors of this and this kind, and then the rest was identity politics. So that was one factor. The second one, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, is that these radical actors, in fact, were encouraged and came to the fore. And so we see the rise of groups such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh. And in a way, their emergence is the result of the failure of the young in the uprisings to present a workable alternative. It is the disillusionment that has led other youths, not necessarily the same ones, but maybe there's some overlap as well, to gravitate toward more radical movements. And you add to that the brutalization that occurred in the repression that we have seen, as well as the civil wars that have evolved, and you can see, again, the further radicalization that is taking place. And of course, there were external factors as well. There was encouragement from external actors. I'll come back to that in a second. Well, the third point is, in fact, the external intervention. Now, the external interventions that we've seen are, first of all, Iran in Iraq and in Syria, and Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And these were, in my view, mostly defensive moves, even though they look very aggressive. And certainly to the people on the ground are extremely aggressive. But they were defensive in the sense that these states were sucked into vacuums when their proxies started to falter. Not only Iran and Saudi Arabia became involved, but then of course, United States and Western states who were going after the Islamic State and Russia have become involved as well, especially in Syria and in Iraq. So these factors contributed to the move away from collapsing states toward active fighting and civil war. Now, yesterday, there was maybe 2 days ago, there was an interesting point made that wasn't fully addressed in the Q&A, as I recall, about the correlation between ethnic and sectarian polarization and foreign intervention. To me, it isn't foreign intervention, it is political manipulation, where you should seek the correlation. But the political manipulation can also come in the form of foreign intervention, of course. But it was also done by the regimes itself. So I would amend that, but depending on the data, and I'd like to see what the data have to say on that, that in fact it's political manipulation, which in some cases takes the form of foreign intervention, which is very real. And if we look now at the dangerous dynamic that is evolved between two regional superpowers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, along sectarian and ethnic lines, we can see how they aggravate the conflicts that are already there. So for analytical purposes, I would like to raise the question, or the point of what I call the concentric circles of conflict in the region. We see local conflicts in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. I'm leaving aside for the moment Libya, which has its own issues. You see the state collapsing. You see the polarization that is taking place and the radicalization. You see the civil war building. You see then that in that fight, the certain parties are weaker and weakening. And so outside powers step in, be it the Gulf states or Turkey or Iran. And at the same time, this further enable, even as they compound the problem of polarization and further drive groups into radical actors, they also allow for the growth of these groups because in fact they are not there to fight these radical groups. To the extent that they are enemies of these groups, they're not fighting them as their first enemy. They're often fighting their proxy's enemy, which is not the radical groups. And so in that additional vacuum, these radical groups further thrive. And then that's the second concentric circle where Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey get involved. And then there's the third one where the United States and Russia get involved. And the situation has become very, very dangerous, especially in northern Syria. Before I was in Iraqi Kurdistan last week, I was in northern Syria as well, not in the area where it's most dangerous though. But it was very telling what was going on because the equation there between the PKK-supported Kurdish parties on the one hand and Turkey on the other, and Russia on a third, and the Syrian regime on another, is so dangerous that any spark, any mistake made by any actor could trigger a conflagration between the United States and Russia. And that is, of course, something nobody wants on our side, but the Kurdish parties, I should say, have to be very careful, and the talk about changing boundaries was the only talk in both Iraqi Kurdistan and Syrian Kurdistan. That's the only thing they want, is to change borders. They get rid of Sykes-Picot 100 years after the borders were drawn. So the Kurdish parties, they want to actually exploit the current chaos. In that sense, they're very similar to Daesh. And I'm talking about the Kurdish parties in Syria, not the ones in Iraq, and to change the borders and to create a larger Kurdistan. At the cost of whatever. And this is very, very dangerous. Now, as part of my little theory of concentric circles, the question is how to de-escalate. And the theory is that you have to go through a reverse process. And I think Ambassador Fahmy already pointed the way and say you have to, first of all, find common ground between Russia and the United States. That is the absolute first step that has to happen. And of course, we see some of it. It's not that the United States and Russia are on the same page. They clearly are not. But they have some common ground. They both have the radical groups as their enemy. But certainly for Russia, that is not the first enemy. The first enemy is the non-radical Syrian opposition. And so that conflict still has to work itself out, and we have to see whether the political process that has been started through the Vienna process is going to lead to results, and it's the only hope we have, frankly. But if that succeeds, and that's a big if, then we can go a level down, and we can say now the United States and Russia can exercise some pressure, some influence, so that the regional superpowers, Iran and the Saudi Arabia and particularly, but also Turkey, of course, start to de-escalate as well. Well, that is another huge challenge. But my argument is that, but only then can you effectively address the crises in Yemen and Iraq in particular. But the process in Syria needs to go along all the while. And then what? How to rebuild? That is a key question that affects all of us, and I very much want to hear the input of the economists as well, because I think what is needed is not a new social contract, but a true social contract. I think that is the key difference. A true social contract is one that is actually negotiated between the state and the citizens. And that notion has to be integrated from the start of rebuilding. First, you need to have a ceasefire. Without that, nothing will happen. Then you need to start the peace-building phase. And it would have to be an inclusive peace-building phase. Inclusive meaning all political actors that are willing to play the political game. It has to be multidimensional. It's got to include economic and political and social and other factors. It needs to be based on political participation. Eventually, it will need to lead to a degree of decentralization through locally based initiatives. Is that dangerous? Someone mentioned this. Yes, it is dangerous. There's no doubt about it. But I think it is inevitable. I don't think we have a choice. And because it's necessary given the fallout and the degree of the fallout from the ethnic and sectarian polarization that we have seen. We need to not only have a social contract, but we need to repair the social fabric. And yes, when you have decentralization, there is bound to be an invigorated scramble for resources, and oil, of course, especially in the countries, some of the countries we are talking about. But that scramble is already taking place during conflict, and hopefully that the peace process will actually help settle some of these claims so that you can rebuild. And finally, you need to rebuild the economies. And I think starting small is the message. I heard the talk about big misses. I don't necessarily disagree, but I think in the immediate post-conflict phase, in order to attract investment, you need operators who are willing to take high risks. You need to start small. And you can base yourself on the informal economy, which, by the way, is thriving, of course. If you go to northern Syria, again, it's not for there's no lack of fuel, and it's not even that expensive. There's no lack of food. When I was in Kamishli, the tomatoes came from Homs, the olives came from Afrin in the west. How did they get there? Well, through Daesh territory. They just levy a fee, that's all. The truck drivers don't care. They are not politically involved. And so there's already an economy there, and there's still industry going on at a small level. And this can be built upon, and I'm talking only about Syria in this case. Now, we've talked about the conflict countries and the post-conflict situation, but the notion of a true social contract is also true for the states still standing, the countries that haven't collapsed. But this is very tricky business because these countries are gaining external support. Why? Because no one wants another state to collapse. But what these states need is a gentle nudging, and I put this very diplomatically, because I'd like to say a big shove, towards reform, and that would allow a new social contract and a true social contract to arise. Because if the support is unquestioned simply in order to maintain regional stability, then in fact the countries will be pushed towards the precipice and to the breakdown precisely for the same factors that precipitated the breakdown in the countries that have already collapsed. So finally, my last words, how about you economists and us non-economists getting together and trying to design the outlines and some of the details of what a true social contract should look like, combining our various areas of expertise. I think you and I can make beautiful music. Thank you very much.